Today on This Week in Space, we discuss Tarek's favorite subject, drinking in space, with Colleen McLeod Garner. Stay with us.
Podcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
This is This Week in Space, episode number 87, recorded on November 10th, 2023, Drinking in Space.
Listeners of this program get an ad-free version if they're members of Club Twit. $7 a month gives you ad-free versions of all of our shows, plus membership in the Club Twit Discord, a great clubhouse for Twit listeners. And finally, the Twit Plus feed with shows like Stacy's Book Club, The Untitled Linux Show, and more. Go to twit.tv/clubtwit. And thanks for your support.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Drinking in Space edition of This Week in Space. I'm joined by my dear old pal, the indomitable Tarek Malik. How are you, Mr. Indomitable?
I'm doing all right. I could use a drink right now at the end of the week, I think. So, to be honest.
Hey, you look like you'd use a drink. So, but today, our guest is subject matter expert in alcohol and spaceflight, Colleen McLeod Garner. How are you this afternoon?
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I'm great. Happy to be here.
You look like you're happy to be in a space station right now. That's a very nice background you've got. I think it looks familiar. All right. But first, we're going to truly plumb the depths today because I'm going to let my partner here tell us a space joke, which he picked up at a premier NASA Field Center. So don't blame us for it. And we even have a graphic for this one. So take it away, Tarek.
That's right. So I went to NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory recently, and everyone knows that I love space puns.
Oh, you were out there when you were out here?
Yeah, it was the same day. It was the same day that we had dinner.
That's right. The day that you came down and stayed at my boat for 2 nights, but didn't take me up to JPL with you. I remember.
Okay, I will remember next time, Ron. Wow, can I tell my joke, Ron?
Oh, were you going to tell a joke? Okay,
or is that it? Is it me? Am I the joke? I don't know.
No. Go for it.
So we went to lunch, me and my friend, at the commissary,
you and your real
Cafe
friend.
167, and they had this sign, and I had to take a picture of it because it's just a bunch of scary Halloween Skittles, and it says, "Why is food tastier in space?" Rod?
Gosh, I don't know, Tarek. Why is food tastier in space?
Because it's meatier, right? Because it's in space.
Thank you.
But look. If you're on the video, you know, the YouTube feed, you know, you can see there's the picture. I'm not lying. I literally, that's what the sign says. So.
You take pride in the strangest things. By the way, I just want to tell people, Cafe 167 sounds like kind of a bougie place, in downtown Boston or something. Welcome to Estate 167 or something. That's just the building number. And the thing you quickly discover at JPL, if you're working there, is that the buildings were numbered like on a military base or older parts of Tokyo for the year they were built, not sequential order. So building 167 can be next to building 4 or building 322. It's very confusing when they say, okay, meet us over here. Like you should know where to find the building, right?
And if you're at NASA, I got specific permission to take that picture at the commissary. So I had permission to snap photography from my PR representative.
Oh, your escort?
Yeah.
Which can I ask this on the air? Which one did you get?
Which what?
Who was your escort?
It was former space.com science writer extraordinaire.
You can't do better than that. All right. Well, don't forget to do us a solid. Make sure to like, subscribe, and all that cool podcast stuff, and send us your jokes because we love your jokes. And clearly, after what you've experienced today, we need your help.
What? So, no, that's a classic.
Please. Love Tarek, but good Lord. All right. So let's do some headlines before everybody decides they've got something better to do.
Yes.
A sad day. We are losing the space race generation of astronauts and NASA personnel at an ever increasing rate because of time. And yesterday, Frank Borman left us. And Frank was part of the second class of astronauts after the original 7. In 1965, he flew, I still can't believe they did this, 14-day endurance mission in Gemini 7 with Jim Lovell. Now, if anybody's ever seen a Gemini capsule in a museum or sat in one, this was a small space capsule where two slightly shorter than average men would sit side by side, almost with their shoulders touching. So imagine yourself sitting in an old sports car like a Mazda Miata or something. But in that Mazda Miata, you had a metal hatch just about touching the top of your space helmet. They sat in that thing doing all the things the human body needs to do for 2 weeks without opening the hatches once. So that was Gemini. And then, of course, he commanded Apollo 8 around the moon very early in the Apollo program when they didn't have a lunar module to bail them out if they had a problem, and retired from NASA to be a senior VP at Eastern Airlines. And then, interestingly, retired from that when airlines were deregulated. He decided he had had enough and ran a Ford dealership with his son, and later took up cattle ranching. Astronauts have the most fascinating life trajectories of anybody I've ever met.
Yeah, it's a sad reality. I mean, Frank was 95 when he passed, sadly, in Billings, Montana. We actually, my colleague Robert Perlman has a really lyrical obituary for him. Robert knew him well over the years. I actually had never had the chance to meet him in person or on the phone. I assume that you did, though, Rod, correct?
I actually did not. Yeah. I spent a lot of time with Jim Lovell, but not with Borman or Anders.
And it's just a sad reality that, these icons and these early pioneers, just like with Neil Armstrong, with Sally Ride, that they are, we are losing them as time wins on, and we need to make sure that we're carrying that legacy on, into space. It takes a certain kind of person to sit on top of a rocket. And I think the jury is still out if you or I are that kind of person, Rod, but Frank Borman
there's no mystery. I am not. But
Frank Borman clearly was.
And a lot of folks online on the groups that I monitor get very maudlin over this, and it is sad to lose these people that have been our heroes for years. But at the same time, I think about the lives they led, and isn't it interesting that astronauts seem to live longer than almost everybody else? People from the space race era. I mean, they were breathing all kinds of toxic things when they were younger, all these carcinogens, all the stuff that was around when they were growing up and I was growing up that should put you down early, didn't. And I have to believe it's because they lived a full and adventurous and wonderfully gratifying life,
Yeah.
So as sad as I am about losing these folks, I think they had incredible experiences that, Tark, I can't speak for you, but I'm never going to come close to that. So I'm really, we'll miss him, but good on you, Frank. And yeah. All right.
I would just point out that he was part of the second class of astronauts. He described space as a vast, lonely, forbidding expanse of nothing, but also that he had gotten into it for the mission, for the goal, for the country, and not for personal achievement too, which was another really interesting, I think, a point in terms of what his life goals were and what he was doing for space. So.
And I should just add before I close on this that during the investigation of the Apollo 1 fire, he testified before the congressional committee that was trying to poke holes in NASA at that time. And it was a rough time. I mean, that was a terrible, terrible, tragic accident and could have easily cost us the moon program. But I think in a lot of ways, Borman was the guy that kind of put an end to that by calling out the senators and saying, look, this is what we do. We're ready for it. And I'm paraphrasing here, but if you guys don't have the spine for it, just let us get on with business. All right. NASA, in their ever-widening quest to dominate the internet, which we welcome because for a lot of years their website was a little behind the times, they have a streaming app.
That's right.
What's it like?
Well, if you're interested in learning more about Frank Borman and his life, you can find it all now at NASA Plus, which is a new on-demand streaming app because
it's free.
It is free that NASA has put together, I guess, to reach the streaming audience these days, how everyone else is getting their information, their news or whatnot. And it's an app, like you mentioned, it's on, Windows, not Windows, on Android and and iPhone. What is that? Mac iOS. Is that how you say it? Yeah. But also apparently it can be incorporated to everything. They made it available for like Disney Plus, Hulu, for those folks to include it as a channel in those services to try to reach a much wider audience. The interesting thing that I found is that it's more than just NASA TV, because NASA has NASA TV on all the time. You can, it's got a regular list of programming. They have a TV guide, like programming guide that you can follow to know like what's on at any given time. This one is really geared towards people who want, short little documentaries. They have documentaries about vintage space, all those old historical archives of which you can find videos of Frank Borman and all of the other Apollo astronauts, all of the programs as well, in 20-minute snippets. Some of them are now nice hour long, and they've got some new shows too, focusing on space weather, the sun, human spaceflight, Mars, that they want to really roll out to reach an audience maybe a little bit easier, someone beyond the YouTube audience that wants to consume their space media on a device that's not the television or a computer. And I guess this is their way to reach it. It is interesting that they are carrying live events there too, so it's not just these recorded programs. Last night's launch of the CRS-29 cargo mission by SpaceX also carried their live. And I'm curious if there's going to be a full pivot to this streaming service as opposed to the other ways that NASA gets their streaming. They stream launches on all of their different social channels, including YouTube, if they're going to pivot to just the streaming service in the future.
Well, and isn't it nice?
All of it, I would imagine. I think it's really, like you said, reaching that audience, right? Yeah. Reaching them where they're at.
And isn't it nice to see a streaming service that doesn't cost $20 a month? Because all the other ones are getting very close to $20 a month.
They are.
So as dull as NASA TV can be at times, and it's better than it used to be. When I used to tune in, it looked like public access television with a couple of people in director's chairs and a blue curtain and a ficus tree, talking about space. It's like, look, show us space. So this is an improvement. All right.
And I highly recommend the iconic. Oh, sorry.
Oh, no. The links that they put on X too, where they call back to, if it's YouTube or you're watching live, they did that with when they were bringing back the sample from Bennu, and you could easily access, instead of saying, where do I see this thing? It would make it very seamless to go back and forth, which is nice.
Yeah. And I highly recommend the iconic NASA tab in the app, just because it has all that vintage stuff and
let me point out that vintage stuff. So on the National Space Society's website, a huge chunk of the hits we get are on our legacy video page. And our legacy video page has recordings of the space shuttle program mostly, and space race stuff, from VHS. So you're looking at 200 lines of resolution on your cell phone, which is not a pleasant experience. So we're trying to update that. But it's amazing how many people go back to that stuff. And if you remember documentaries from the 60s and early 70s, they were all very serious. NASA, narrated by Richard Basehart, the Shakespearean actor, dun, 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 with all this heavy music and stuff. And they're quaint at this point to watch them. And of course, then in the 80s, 90s, the IMAX films came along and completely changed how we do space documentaries. But anyway, I could talk about this all afternoon. We don't need that. What we do need is for Tarek to quickly do his third headline so we could talk to our guest.
Oh, yeah. I mean, you know what? I have this one really great story from my colleague Monisha Ravasetti over at space.com, just because it was a surprise breakout for us. But there was this little tiny satellite from, I believe, Slovenia, Trisatur 1. I'm sure it is
well pronounced.
An acronym. And it's got this it's a CubeSat that is studying like the Van Allen radiation belts.
Yeah.
But it has a camera on it that's like the size of the edge of a coin. It's like super tiny, and it was primarily just an experiment science camera to see what they can do. And so that they managed to capture a picture of Earth, and it's a super blurry picture of the Earth, and the Earth looks really, really strange because it looks like it's all brown and green instead of blue. And Monisha just had this great approach, because to her, even though it's like this, to us, a spoiled people with super HD cameras in space, a really kind of janky picture of the planet. To her, it was perfect because it feels like something she could take herself with the cell phone. And this was totally unexpected that they could actually take it. There's no navigation to point the cameras at the planet or anything. It uses these magnetic torquer things that interact with the Earth's magnetic field to maintain its attitude control out there in orbit, and yet they were still able to capture this. And to them, the test was to use the camera to see if they could replace certain aspects of the Earth's atmosphere and replace the colors so they could identify how things work. And it worked. It worked just fine. So it's this success story wrapped in this tiny little package by Slovenia. So congrats to them. It's only their second satellite, and the scientists are thrilled. And it's an example of how science gets done in space that doesn't always get like all of the big shouts and glory, right? Because these little tiny tech demonstrations are what gets you the better cameras on all the other vehicles in the future. I really like that one. It was kind of just a standout, fun little story at space.com that we had this week. There's a lot of news to choose from. We had a lot of rocket launches. Virgin Galactic is going to stop space tourism flights mid next year so they can build an even bigger space tourism spacecraft. They also laid off a bunch of people.
You're cheating.
A lot of other news that were going
stories,
on. This was a happy little story that I thought I'd like to end the week on as we get into the
So
weekend.
I'm glad you explained it because I was reading it and I thought, I don't quite get it. But what I did love was the addition to the unending series of comparisons of scales that we get in space stories, has as much thrust as 9,000 elephants farting or something like that. And this one was the size of the edge of a coin, which you could have said, the size of a hummingbird's prostate or who knows what. I mean, you could have found all kinds of ways. But the edge of a coin, I thought, well, that's creative. I believe Ant has something to say. Are you with us, dear TD?
Yeah, yes, sir. So you said this camera is like the size of an edge of a coin?
It's super tiny. It's super tiny.
That's freaking amazing considering what it produced there. And I'm glad you brought up the point that we have been spoiled with our HD screens and so forth, and even with our new iPhone 15 Pro Max camera, whatever they call these things now. This is freaking amazing. Yes, it sort of looks like Venus or something with that color, but that's freaking amazing. You'll
appreciate this, and they have clear. I'm sure I'm gonna pronounce it wrong. Borosilicate glass lenses that they attach directly to a 320 by 320 pixel image sensor, and that's the camera. That's like the little tiny one that they built.
So tiny.
It's so small. So.
Okay, you guys get a room. I want to go into an ad. We will be right back after this message from our sponsor to talk to Colleen. Go nowhere because the good stuff is about to begin. All right. So, Colleen, it is such a pleasure to have you and to talk about what I know is one of Tarek's favorite topics, which is drinking. I know. Where did I get that? Well, you were the one that came down to my boat and spent all that time telling me about your adventures down at USC when I was as dry.
I was a model student, Mom and Dad. Model student.
Yeah, okay. All right. So, Colleen, we've met a couple of times, but the most recent time was at the Space Settlement Summit over at the Thunderbird campus in Phoenix, where you're enrolled in. Describe your program to us because it looks and sounds fascinating. I wish I had time to do it.
Yeah, well, make time because it's amazing. So it's at the Thunderbird, ASU's Thunderbird School of Global Management, and the Executive Master's Program is a rather long sentence, but it's Space Leadership, Business, and Policy. So it's really kind of the only one of its kind, which is pretty fascinating. Really excited to be in it. I'm in the second cohort. So, we get people from all walks of life. And it's not just the professors and the access to, some of the field trips we get to go on, but it's also the people that are in the cohort. And it really is that idea that really everyone is welcome in the space industry, which is really encouraging because I am not a scientist and I am not an engineer. So
join the club.
There, when I was first talking to Dr. Autry about the program. I already had a master's degree in global innovation, and I saw this and I saw all these pictures, and I was like, wow, this is really, really cool. And, it was, hey, I'm not sciencey. Like I'm fascinated by this. I see a business gap and all this other stuff. And that's why we need you to be in the program, because you don't think like a scientist or engineer. You think, from this different perspective, and that's how we come up with innovation. And it has proved true. So it's been a very fulfilling and fun ride so far.
So the only thing that's longer than the name of the program is Greg Autry's title, which I don't have at my fingertips right now. But this is a guy who, gosh, I guess I've known Greg for about 10 years, who came out of doing, I think, general entrepreneurship primarily at University of Southern California, then moved over to ASU and it kind of invented from whole cloth, I think, this program that is one of the first of its kind, which really takes a run at space from an entrepreneurial angle purely. So there's a kind of an attempt at some of that at the University of North Dakota years ago. And there have been a couple of other smaller programs, not always from recognized academic institutions, but I think this was the first officially recognized real master's program of its kind. So I've given a couple of lectures to your classes, and I have to say, so I taught university level about 10 years and I enjoyed it, but they were kids, and this was a chance to talk to a room full of smart space professionals that were really, really engaged. Because, often when you're teaching freshmen or juniors, they're kind of staring out the window and scrolling on their phones and stuff. Not the case with you guys. And that's a real pleasure. And it was exciting to make everybody's acquaintance. So, if you have interest in this program, check out thunderbird.asu.edu/ it's kind of long, Thought Leadership Center's Space Leadership Initiative. Just look up Thunderbird Greg Autry, Autry, and you'll find it.
We'll have a link on the screen.
The other differentiator really of the program is that, you're seeing academia come up with more and more of these, which I think is fantastic. Mm-hmm. But it is certainly one of the only ones where the people running the program actually worked in space. They didn't come from aeronautics or whatever. They actually worked in space. Dr. Autry was, in the midst of being sworn in by Congress to be the CFO of NASA. So,
and was on the transition team shortly before that.
He was, exactly.
Not an easy thing.
Yeah. So, you're being taught by space leaders, and then, we get behind the scenes tours. Tara mentioned JPL. I was just there, and I got to see what was going on with the Clipper for Europa, and I was just like a kid in a candy shop, and it's really cool. And you get to go really, and we went to Rocket Lab, and we have all these other things that are really, really powerful, because you're not siloed into one specific, part of the industry. You're getting a peek at all of it, which is really, really cool.
Yeah, and I've been to a lot of the places you're talking about, but to be able to go in the context that you did with a group, and they're putting on a specific performance for you, and you're there, and you've got Greg there to contextualize everything, and his associates as well, of course. That's just a real treat. Yeah. So that's all great, but the real reason we have you here today is to talk about getting snockered in space.
Yes.
Although we probably wouldn't put it that way.
No, we won't.
You needed an acronym, right?
Let's start. Let's start with a little bit of history. We know that. So the U.S. Navy, for instance, has been dry since 1914.
Right.
And NASA has been dry pretty much since its origins, at least officially. The Soviet space program, on the other hand, there's not a lot of documentation about it, but we know there's been some cognac, and I think we can trust there's been vodka up there because it sort of runs in the veins of the spacecraft. So can you tell us a little bit about the history of the relationship between, moderate drinking and spaceflight? Because we know what happens on the ground before space flight and after, but off the ground, I guess, is what we're talking about here.
Well, I think, honestly, it's been up there since, before we put a boot on the ground. I mean, you had Buzz Aldrin drinking communion wine before he stepped onto the moon. And
just a thimble, though. He was very careful to say, okay, it's just a thimble.
Yeah, well, there's conflicting. I mean, if you get the chalice and you're swirling it around and it looks like black pudding or whatever, obviously they didn't advertise that. I don't think that even now, I don't think that the public would probably take too kindly to openly drinking alcohol while operating a very expensive machine that they're paying for. So, but it has been up there the whole time. And I think what's fascinating is that, yeah, you're right. The ISS is zero tolerance. Here's the loophole, though. You go under R&D and you are good to go, buddy. I mean, it's open season. And they've done some really cool experiments up there, I think, and some not so cool experiments. Obviously some of the things that they've done, they probably should have tapped someone like me on the shoulder to say, do you think this is a good idea? And I would have told you absolutely not. They did one experiment where they thought sherry would be a really cool idea because it's fortified. But it's also very noxious.
It's fortified? What does that mean?
Well, it means it's pretty much indestructible as something that, has been able to be stable versus something like champagne or whatever, right? But the thing about it is, you can't open up a window in space, so there's that. And
gee, what are you alluding to? Okay.
And also too, depending on the type of liquid you're putting up there, if it's beer, wine, spirits, there's different gases involved. There's different, like with beer, there's different levels of gas and how they interact in the human body. So yeah, I mean, I would surmise that the Russian side right now is probably a lot more fun.
Well, the gases you're talking about are before the drink goes into your body. So I assume we're talking about carbonation and the bad things carbonation does in 0 G to your stomach.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah, I mean, it's both, right? I mean, CO2 and the way that, yeast is a fascinating microorganism that does things to your body. And we'll leave it there.
I was going to say the Russians do have that toast, that pre-launch toast that they always have, the vodka toast and whatnot. That's what I'm aware of. Can I just ask a clarification question, Colleen?
Yeah.
Because when you say experiments, what actually is an experiment? Is it, I'm going to just classify this as like a research experiment and then we send it up there and the experiment is that they get tanked on it, or is it like some other kind of like actual like chemistry type of study?
Sciencey,
Okay.
So, they had, and this is well documented. They had Ardbeg was up there. They had a control, and then they had the test. Like a little tiny test tube with a wood chip inside of it.
Oh, this was whiskey?
Yeah, this was whiskey.
Okay.
Right. So, and the other companies have done it as well, to see if it was going to age in space. Right. Mm-hmm. And I could have told you that it will absolutely do nothing to the liquid. But it makes a fun story. Right. I know that there's a couple of beer companies that have put stuff up on rockets. Right. Mm-hmm. So they're like not necessarily on the ISS. And then used it sort of as a marketing gimmick to say, oh, this is yeast, space yeast, and it's kind of fun. But my thing on this, is really looking like bigger and longer term vision, for, something that I like to always talk about, which is like creating that normalcy, because we know there's going to be a permanence in space, right? We know that we're going to have multiple settlements on the moon, right? We know that we want to go to Mars. What does normal, everyday human activity look like? Because every astronaut that I've spoken with, there's a normalcy to sitting down and breaking bread with one another, right? And having that camaraderie. And I think that we don't have to look too far back during the COVID times to say how important that really is. So I'm going to get off my soapbox now.
No, that's fine. And I should add, I think I omitted to mention that you have an expert background in alcohol and alcohol distribution, and do stand positioned, I think, potentially in the not too distant future, to become the vendor of preference to space endeavors and space tourism endeavors. I mean, somebody's got to supply that stuff. And when Colleen comes to a space event, which she does with some regularity, as do I, it's always a pleasant moment, because besides being able to share your wonderful company, I know that you usually have samples squirreled away somewhere from the wares that you distribute, which is
absolutely
helpful for us.
mean, I put that under R&D, Rod. Come on.
Yeah. So tell us about what you do in your civilian days.
Yeah, I mean, right now my regular day job is, I'm director of sales for a very high-end organic tequila company. And I love to bring all of that fun stuff to any of the space conferences that I go to or speak at. And because, some of the conferences, they can get a little dry. And so you kind of try to...
Oh, you're so kind.
Because this should be fun, right? Yeah. It should be something that that's inspiring and that we are all getting super excited about. And, I think going back to what we were talking about with NASA, I think that they are definitely trying to reinvent themselves and bring in that younger crowd. And they've done a really good job. I sponsored Comic-Con last year, and I just loved it because there were so many young people that were just so excited to come and hear from astronauts, and from, SpaceX was there, and, Virgin Galactic was there, and all these things. And that's what we need right now. So tell us a little bit about, let's look at the positives first. What are some of the desirable aspects of imbibing alcohol in space? Why might we do it? And what are the benefits? Well, I mean, I think that it depends on the person, and I want to definitely say that my whole stance on this is really responsible, like being responsible about it, and just really going back to the idea of creating a normalcy for us to be up there, right? And so I'll preface that this isn't let's go get jacked up in space. This is let's be responsible, but know that we're being realistic as well. And the positives of it, if you are drinking in moderation, we need to do more research, certainly, on the effects of, depending on where we are, right? On if we're on the ISS and it's 0 gravity, or if we're on the moon and it's 1/16 gravity, or if we're on Mars and it's 38% gravity. It's a very different environment. The good is, obviously, probably less stress. Like I said, there's a normalcy there. There's a creature comfort that's there. And that when you're dealing with a hostile environment that wants to kill you when you walk outside, probably want something to bring down the stress level, would be my guess. So, I mean, that's some of the positives, right? And I think also, too, if you think about it, when we're looking at the idea of a closed loop system or recycling and all these things, that's part of it too. So, and also keep in mind too, that any alcohol is a plant. And so when we're looking at growing agriculture in space, and we're looking at recycling that stuff, right? These are plants. You can take that and mix it with some yeast and a little bit of sugar, and bada boom, there you go. Very simple.
So it's interesting you bring up the closed loop life support, because of course, we have that in the International Space Station, where they're recycling roughly 98% of the, we'll put it delicately, liquids that are both brought up and recycled. but to that point, and especially if you're talking about, staying long term in a habitat on the moon or the transit to Mars. I mean, as it is now, NASA bans even alcohol, in trace amounts in aftershave and mouthwash. I mean, aftershave, for God's sakes. Not that, I don't know who uses aftershave anymore except for Ant probably. But, for most of us, it's kind of a non-thing. I'm going to pay for that later, by the way, because he is in control of all the dials and levers here.
Yes, you will.
Coming in spicy.
But there's a concern there about it entering the life support system loop. And we had Grant Anderson on last week talking about life support and how delicate it can be. So in terms, great guy. In terms of imbibing, in amounts that are meaningful enough. I mean, it's one thing to have a chalice the size of a thimble where you're drinking red wine in the lunar module. Mm-hmm. But when you're talking about being in a closed loop system that's, operating for months and months as opposed to lunar module, which was a couple of days, mm-hmm. What are the risks in terms of both just the liquid itself and the after effects after it's gone through the human physiology?
Well, I'm certainly Grant would. Actually, we've had this exact conversation. We were at the Mars conference in DC earlier this year, and we had a long, lengthy conversation about that. Obviously, we know even just on Earth, when you're drinking, obviously you have to pee more, right? So if you're on a closed loop system, it's probably no secret that there's a lot more liquid going on. And so, and I think, the list of negatives, there's many, right? And that's why I think that we need to do more research on this stuff because, what does, the blood alcohol content, how does that even play in? And furthermore, going back to our physiology is, astronauts can't taste anything in space, right?
Oh, good point. Yeah.
And the reason they can't, right, is that all the liquid, all your blood and everything is floating. And so you feel like you have this constant head cold. So as an astronaut, you're putting sriracha on everything, or you're putting salt or soy sauce or something because you can't taste anything, right? And so, but that again is only on the ISS. But if you're looking at, again, if you look at these different environments, we got to treat them differently, right? On the moon or Mars. So yeah, obviously in a closed loop, you're going to need to be mindful of the amount of liquid that will be produced, through urine drinking, obviously.
Well, Tarek, I hate to jump in, but we have to take a quick break before your next question, and then we'll be back for more. Take 5.
Well, yeah, my next question, Colleen, because you kind of hinted at it about the togetherness aspect, the communal aspect. There is no 10 forward, lounge on the International Space Station right now. But of course, it's a staple from Star Trek. But we're at a point right now in time where in the near future, possibly by the end of this decade, there will be one, if not more, private, stations or facilities in space serving a variety of interests from NASA because they want that continued presence in orbit to commercial scientists who are doing their own research, maybe even on the space beer of the future, to tourists that are going to want basically what you're describing right here, which is a way to relax and get the views, the experience while sharing with friends or compatriots there. And I'm curious about how that aspect of life in space will either change, how it gets monitored, right? Because life on a space station is very much like life on the airplane. You can't go crazy and like smack people around or act out or anything like that when you get on the plane, or you're never going to get to where you want to go. And so at least in the fairly near term where you have a permanent settlement or station that has maybe more relaxed relaxed rules or regulations, how do you see that being incorporated into the operation so that visitors know what the norms are for alcohol and whatnot, and that they act, I guess, accordingly?
Well, I think that's a great question. And I think it's kind of it's going to be, I'm going to try to make it not long-winded. There's a difference between a space tourism concept versus a permanency, right? So right now we look at the space tourism, right? And we look at and that can encompass anything from, the high altitude balloons. There's a couple companies that are offering, you're on the edge of space, right? And on those, you have this premier experience, right? And you better, given the price point for that ticket,
$250,000. Yeah,
I think that's space perspective. That's going to have a wet bar, like in the capsule.
They do. Yeah. I actually talked with Jane about that, and they have a ultra luxe lounge. There's another company that's out of France that they have Michelin star meals that are being prepared. Again, the difference between moving space tourism into a permanent settlement for humankind. There's a massive difference. And I think a lot of the companies that are coming out on the commercial side are certainly starting to explore more and more with the space tourism as they get everything up and running and we get more of a regularity there, bringing that price point down for the regular people to go. And then, again, building into a permanency. So there's a lot going on there because I think a lot of those companies are trying to move away from the billionaire boys club to say, again, we want everyone. And I think, you brought up Virgin Galactic earlier, and, they just had another launch this week where you're showing them making an adamant effort on the DE&I aspect. You're bringing in all of these other aspects to break the mold on this is only for billionaires because they want all of us, right? But right now, of course, it's very expensive until we can figure out launch and all the countries that are starting to try to do that. ESA just came out with a new structure that they wanted to bring in more commercial, just like we're doing in the US. Mm-hmm. There's a lot going on there.
Yeah. Well, I guess the follow up there.
Answered your question.
No, it does. Well, while you were talking, like it brought to mind, like you were talking about the commercial aspect of it. And of course, in the United States, the FAA has a lot to say when it comes to the Virgin Galactics, the Blue Origins, the private launches of the world here or of the US. And I'm curious if there's going to be like a liquor license requirement then for these experiences that people might need on a permanent basis. Well, you think they're expensive
for the corner liquor store. Can you imagine what they're going to cost for space?
Yeah, I don't know.
Well, that actually brings up a lot of, and I've actually, there's an organization called Discus, and they're the Distilled Spirits Council of North America. And they do a lot of the legislation and have all the lobbyists. And I spoke at their conference earlier this year. And it's interesting because, when you look at law for alcohol, it's different federally, it's different versus the states, different internationally. In the United States, we have something called the 3-tier law, right? Where it was implemented after Prohibition in order to make sure people weren't drinking, lead gin and dying, crap like that. But it's there for a reason. And that's a US thing, right? And so if, what does that law look like? Is it I'm adhering to the 3-tier system until I'm buying the alcohol in Cape Canaveral, and then we put the alcohol on the shuttle, and now we're good to go? Versus, hey, some people are using moon dust to grow wine vines. Mm-hmm. And now you're talking about indigenous, are we able to do that? So again, it just depends on the capabilities. But yeah, honestly, it's like, do we need a space bartender? Yeah, of course we do.
Are you
someone's going to make actual moonshine. I guarantee you.
Yes!
On the moon. Someone is going to do it. Yeah. We're probably going to find out like 50 years later in someone's tell-all book, it's going to be something like that. So,
I know you've been waiting to use that term.
No, I just came up with that too. You can have that.
All right.
That's right.
Hey,
it just calls back to For All Mankind. I'm like so excited for the new season, but a lot of that stuff comes up on the show, and it's like these are human things that will happen.
All right. Well, we're going to be back with my question about more human things in just a moment. Stand by. So we know some of the things that happen when you consume alcohol in space. The data is pretty spotty, and the best data comes from the Soviet Union days of space flight, which of course is harder to get your hands on. But we do know that in 0G, your body apparently absorbs the alcohol more quickly because it's weightless and it's distributed around your stomach lining. It's not just sitting in the bottom third, I guess. But also you have a lowered metabolic rate, which allow the effects to last longer. So you have this kind of compounded, you can get schnockered faster and it takes longer to get out of your system. How does that play into what we're talking about here in the long term?
Well, I mean, I think honestly, there's a couple other components that we need to address. And this is the same on Earth as it would be in zero gravity or on the moon or on Mars, is all these other pieces of what'd you eat? When's the last time you had food? How much have you slept? How much stress do you have right now? What's your stress level? All these things play into how alcohol affects your system. So like on Earth, right? If you had a big cheeseburger before you go out to the clubs, probably going to be able to have a couple of drinks and be, okay, right? Versus I didn't eat all day and I went straight for the shots, right? Totally different experience, right? And the same could be said in any other environment of, are you sleeping? What's your stress level? What'd you eat? All these things do come into play about how we metabolize alcohol. And plus, it also depends on your gender. It depends on if you're a man or a woman, and how we metabolize alcohol. It also depends on the health of your liver, right? It depends on your age. There's all these other factors that need to be looked at. And again, more research needs to be done.
Why are you laughing about your liver, Rod? What?
Well, actually, my liver is one of the few organs I can count on to be in perfect shape because I hardly ever drink. But I did read something. I was reading about, I guess it was consumption of beer in 0G. And one term that came up frequently was wet burp. What is a wet burp? I don't believe I've ever had one, except for having the flu, maybe.
Sounds really gross, right? I mean, it's what we were talking about earlier with the gases, right? So you're dealing with, when you look at beer, what is it made of, right? It's made of cereal grain. And you've also got water, which is like 95% water in beer. And then you've got yeast. And so depending on the type of beer you're drinking, and it depends on the type of yeast that's being used, if it's an ale or a lager, there's all kinds of different things that go on. But I mean, essentially, you've only got really 4 main components in that. When yeast consume sugar, they produce CO2 and heat. All right. So it's got to go somewhere. So if you're consuming a beer, right, you're drinking all of these things, and it's kind of like this living probiotic going on in your body, right? And so it's got to go somewhere. And so that is a really nasty term that I did not come up with, but I've certainly heard multiple times over. And again, you can't open a window in space. And so that's an issue. So there's that.
Are we dancing around the word fart? Am I allowed to say that, right? Because that's what it sounds like we're talking about.
Child. Right? Wait a minute. I'm canceling you right now.
I wanted to ask, because we were talking about burps earlier. And I just need to clarify, because it could be both, I guess. Right?
Well, you could say a lower district burp, but go ahead.
It's gotta go somewhere.
Oh man, no. Well, you had mentioned, Colleen, about some of the other types of experiments that companies have done. Like I was doing just at space.com a quick look back, and there was like a student experiment where they partnered with Budweiser to try to see like some effects about the brewing process. Japan's Ninkasi, sent some yeast up, and then they brought it back to make beer, and then I think they sold it or cultured it over time, and then there was one experiment to age red wine in space and to see how it tasted different. And I guess they found that it did in fact taste different, and that they could probably sell a bottle of that for $1 million way back when. I don't know if they tried to or not, but are those all just gimmicks then, like by companies to try to get like like extra sales boost or attention, or is that the kind of stuff that food service corporations have to do now to set up the types of consumables that in that permanence, because you're not always going to want to ship it from here to the moon or to Mars or whatever. I would assume they'd have to come up with a way that they could make these just like other foodstuffs in a way that it doesn't, if it's going to create extra CO2, you have to figure out how to account for that then in your life support systems and whatnot. I mean, so how much of it is gimmicky marketing right now and actual research for in-space utilization, when we have a permanent human, settlement across the solar system?
I think that's an interesting question. And the reason I say that is that, I think if somebody in a company in my industry is looking at a space strategy, that's a win. That is a huge win. Somebody is thinking outside the box. I mean, when I was in graduate school, I came across the Virgin Galactic Grey Goose partnership, and I was like, what is this thing? This is so cool. So that tells me that someone's being future forward thinking. And I think that is really, really cool. Whether or not whatever specific company is doing this experiment for a marketing gimmick or not, I who knows? I feel like, certainly brands that come back and bring their stuff back, they'll sell it. I mean, Ardbeg did, and certainly Petrus did the same thing. And other companies have done that. But I think it's kind of trite to just say, I want to do a marketing gimmick, right? You could have spent $500,000 on a lot of other stuff with your budget that year for marketing. So maybe it is a longer term vision of that company like Budweiser. I mean, I remember a couple of years ago during Super Bowl, they said they wanted to be the official beer of Mars, right? How cool. And they did do experiments on growing hops in space. So, I mean, I think it's kind of twofold. And again, it goes back to what is that longer term vision instead of this sort of flash in the pan. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Which seems a little bit trite.
I should point out, you mentioned Petrus. Petrus was the company that actually had the Chateau Petrus 2000 back in that they aged on the space station. I mean, I guess SpaceX was gimmicky with their, hey, we're going to land rockets, and now they land rockets all the time now.
Yeah, but can you imagine, Tarek, spending the time and money, the 7 months it would take, frying your DNA, losing your bone structure to 0G, going through the rigors of a landing on Mars, you stagger into the saloon in the station down the Martian surface, and you say, give me your best beer, and they say, it's Budweiser. I mean, what a moment.
I thought you were going to say this.
But would that be so weird? I mean, that might be like...
No!
Oh, no, that sound comes from Coors Light, not Budweiser, but go ahead, sorry.
I think that you might have tastes that are slightly more refined than the rest of us who are just looking for a relaxing drink at the end of the day. I thought you would get to say, and this is to Colleen's point, you could get a Mars landing that, instead of saying, it's one small step, it would be this Mars landing brought to you by
one small step,
Budweiser, or something like that.
I do believe your reference may have been the first time anybody's ever put refined and me in the same paragraph. I appreciate that. So Colleen, we got to get to this before we run out of time. Okay. One of the big problems with alcohol is that it impairs your motor and cognitive skills. Sure. That has ramifications for space missions. Yep. So there's a couple of questions within this question. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the U.S. Navy's been dry since about 110 years ago. And there's a reason for that. They're operating big, dangerous machines out there, and they don't want a bunch of drunks stumbling around doing it like the British Navy might have done in the 1700s and 1800s. That's a bit of an exaggeration, but you know where I'm going. So, I mean, does this become, at least for moderate space flight duration where you don't have these huge worries about what it's going to do to life support and all that, does this become a crew can't drink and passengers can kind of thing in the commercial space flight era? Or do we just have kind of a medium term ban on it until we fully understand it? Or do we understand it enough to regulate it now?
I mean, I think it could probably be any of the three depending on the appetite. I mean, it really depends on, where's your funding coming from? if you're being funded by the government, I would surmise that you probably are going to be zero tolerance. But if it's a commercial company and you're spending $250, $450 or whatever you're spending on a ticket, it's probably going to be like, I'm on a cruise ship and the guy driving the boat is not drinking while I can drink because I have a specialty cocktail menu with a Michelin star dinner. Then I'm gonna have that awesome cocktail, or I'm gonna have that really nice glass of wine because I paid for it. Versus, again, fast forward to when we have, the settlements going on and we're all working and we go to the end of the day and stuff like that. So I think it just depends on where you are and who's funding your enterprise.
So no barrel of space grog, right? Is that what it is?
I mean, the thing is, you could totally do that. And when I used to run Whistle Pig whiskey, and my thing was, let's put an entire barrel in the ISS because that's where you actually have a decent experiment. Yeah. Then you're talking about a space constraint, right? and that's, space is real estate and it is very, very expensive. So again, and until we get to that place where the technology is there and the cost comes down a little bit, I mean, certainly it will open up wider and wider as we go.
Yeah.
Excuse me for jumping in, Tarek, but I just have to say what Colleen just said about actually brewing a board reminded me of my much younger days of poverty in the film industry when my roommate was an actor who was also poverty stricken. And his desperation for alcohol at the time led him to get fruit smoothies, shake them up, crack them, set them back in the refrigerator for about 3 weeks, and then drink whatever came out of that mixture, which tended to be alcoholic, but did not appeal to me in the slightest. But I suppose you could do the same thing in the space station if you were desperate enough.
Did it actually work? Because yeast has to be like at a certain temperature. It ain't going to be eating anything. It'll be hibernating.
Okay.
Your fridge not refrigerating?
Well, I mean, as I said, poverty was the thing. So
was it a real fridge or was it just a box with some racks in it?
I'm like,
I take the fifth on this.
Okay, all right, you're poverty stricken.
Yeah. I might add that we did have to manage to find a way to bypass the shut-off power system a few times with extra wire, but that's another conversation.
Got it.
Statute of limitations is up, however.
I think I have time for one last question,
yes,
Rod. My main, and this is just, Colleen, it's a personal question, if you don't mind, because I think everyone wonders what it would be like to go to space, and I'm curious if you have an aperitif of choice if you were on a flight, and what you'd want to. Yeah, I had to look that word up actually. So for like a meal, for a drink with a meal in space, is there one that you think would partner particularly well with space flight or zero G or just gazing at the Earth from above? So,
I mean, for me personally, I love Belgian beer, and anything that. I used to sell Belgian beer, and I got to have the opportunity to train underneath some generational brewers. And it is very much an art. And I would probably say something to that effect, a Belgian beer that's pretty old in age, where the tasting notes on that usually are, horse blanket or,
Did you say horse blanket?
Yeah, it's like a tasting note.
Like that musky feeling, yeah.
Oh, I'm leaving the room. Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
Refined taste.
Yeah, something that's a Yakuza, something that's older. Because again, if you're not being able to taste anything, then you need something that's going to be a little bit punchy.
Yeah,
like horse sweat. Okay.
Yeah,
I got it.
You, Rod, what would you want to have a drink in space?
Well, I'm a cigar smoker, so I think of things like it has a note of pepper and a chocolatey finish or something. I generally don't think of sucking on horse blankets, but I'm open to all kinds of new experiences, and if it lets me go to space, I'll consider a horse blanket.
No.
Plus, it'd have the added advantage that I'd have to stuff it in my mouth, and that would shut me up for a while. Because when I drink, as bad as my sense of humor is here, when I drink, it gets looser and more inappropriate, and none of us want that.
Well, and the one thing I would add is certainly Casa Azul Blanco tequila would be the choice if for actually like an ultra if I was like, hey, we're taking this trip and I'm going I'm celebrating my wedding anniversary in zero gravity or whatever it is. Yeah, I'm going to want a nice cocktail, tequila as an agave plant, organic. Would be a very good choice as well.
Okay, so Tarek, when you and I finally get our big trip up to orbit, she has to come, okay?
I think so.
Because it's just you and me. It'll be a bad podcast and boredom, but if she comes along, it will be.
I do have 4 bottles of blue Romulan ale from a Star Trek promotion about 25 years ago. I could bring that out. That could be fun, right?
Here he goes.
How have you been storing it till today is the question.
Oh, it's just been in a room on a shelf.
Of course.
It's fine, right, Colleen? It's fine.
It's in glass. What can go wrong?
I don't know if it's near heat or light. Could be worse than a horse blanket. I'll tell you that.
Well, given our experience with Dr. Malik here in technology, I would not count a lot on his good shape, because he spends a lot of time off camera talking about, my Windows machine won't do this and my Android phone. Anyway, enough of me picking on you poor man. So, Colleen, Thank you so much for joining us today for our exploration of alcohol in space. And where can we keep up with your overall progress and your Thunderbird experience? Because we all now want to, of course, know more about that.
Yeah, you can just find me on LinkedIn. There's my name. I'm pretty easy to find. And I often put up a lot of stuff, not only for Casa Azul, but certainly all the space conferences that I like to sponsor, and do what I can on my side to amplify the message of responsible drinking and normalcy in space and women in space, and anyone can be in space. Look at me. So, just find me on LinkedIn.
All right. And for people that want to get a personal sample of Casa Azul, you're going to have to, you can, of course, go buy it yourself, or you can show up to the National Space Development Conference this coming May 2024 in Los Angeles, where we will undoubtedly have some samples. Tarek, where are you inebriatedly orbiting these days yourself?
Again, I'm an angel. Just ask my parents. But no, you can find me at space.com. As always, got a good piece about Starfield coming up that I'm pretty excited about. And then on the Twitter at Tarek J. Malik as well. And this weekend, you will find me in Fortnite, because they're building the rocket. And they're going to launch that rocket this month, and that's going to be really exciting. And I have to go check that out. And you can find all about that at my channel at Spacetron Plays on YouTube. So
she's drinking.
Just a reminder to everybody,
right.
This is a game, and it's a little bit like in the dark old days when I used to work on Star Trek, and people would call up the post bay and start asking me questions about what was happening on deck 14 with that weird door they had never seen before. And I had to remind them all the ship was only 8 feet long and it was pretend, and they got very upset. So I'll just remind everybody that this is Tarek's game channel. Doesn't have any relation to reality except his, but that's just me because I'm a grumpy old boomer. And of course, you can find this grumpy old boomer at pilebooks.com and at astromagazine.com, and occasionally giving talks. I gave a lovely talk yesterday down at the Bowers Museum in Santa Ana to about 300 people. Mm-hmm. I think I skewed the age average down by about a decade, but it was fantastic because everybody was listening. And unlike my teaching experience in the bad old days at universities, nobody was scrolling their phone. They were just sitting there listening to what I had to say, which was fantastic. Anyway, don't forget to drop us a line if you're listening and not scrolling on your phone at twist at twit.tv. That's TWYS at twit.tv. We always welcome your comments, suggestions, ideas, and we answer each and every email. Especially if you send us a joke, I'll answer that one first. And don't forget to check out space.com. The website's the name, and the National Space Society at NSS.org, where our new website will be up in about a week. It'll be a much more enjoyable experience. Both are great places to satisfy your space curiosities. New episodes of this podcast published every Friday on your favorite podcatcher, so make sure to subscribe. Tell your friends, give us reviews. Thumbs up, 5 stars, 5 beers, whatever it is you want to give us. A wet burp, it's up to you. We'll take them all. As long as it's meant in a positive way. And you can head to our website at twit.tv/twists. And don't forget, you can get all the great programming on the Twit network ad-free on Club Twit, as well as some extras that are only available there because we like it that way. For $7 a month, you'll help support the network. And frankly, we could use it. You've heard Leo Laporte talking about tough times facing podcasters on his weekend show, and that's true across the board. The advertising is not coming in over the transom like we'd like, so your support is always welcomed. Finally, you can follow the Twit Tech Podcast Network at Twit on Twitter and on Facebook, and twit.tv on Instagram. Thank you very much. Thank you, Colleen. Thank you, Tarek. It's been a thrill, and I'll see you next week.
Hey there, Scott Wilkinson here. In case you hadn't heard, Home Theater Geeks is back. Each week, I bring you the latest audio-video news, tips and tricks to get the most out of your AV system, product reviews, and more. You can enjoy Home Theater Geeks only if you're a member of Club Twit, which costs $7 a month, or you can subscribe to Home Theater Geeks by itself for only $2.99 a month. I hope you'll join me for a weekly dose of home theater geekitude.